You might think of a bed as a private place, a soft sanctuary, somewhere warm, quiet, where the lights are dim and the door is closed. But in the Middle Ages, a bed wasn't always yours. It wasn't always soft. And privacy, that was a luxury few could afford. Let's begin in a small village, not in a castle, not even in a town, but in the world of the average peasant. Their home was likely a one-room hut, walls made of wattle and daub, with a thatched roof that leaked during rain. There were no separate bedrooms, no curtains, no locks. The bed, if they even had one, was a wooden frame stuffed with hay, straw, or leaves, and it was shared. That's the first thing you have to understand. Medieval people didn't sleep alone. Not just lovers or spouses, whole families, including children, and even visiting travelers, often bundled together at night. You didn't have your own pillow or even your own corner. You had warmth, and that warmth often came from whoever lay beside you. And the bed, in many cases, wasn't even a bed. It might be a pile of rags in the corner, a fur on the floor, or in some cases, a bench near the hearth. The richer you were, the higher off the ground you slept. But even then, the idea of a master bedroom simply didn't exist. When it came to intimacy, this setup made things complicated. Imagine trying to express affection to your partner while your in-laws sleep 2 feet away. Imagine the hush of the room, the crackle of the hearth, the slow breathing of your children, and the knowledge that any movement might be noticed. This is why medieval couples developed an extraordinary sense of discretion. But let's not rush into the act itself. Let's talk about the furniture of desire, if we can call it that. Because what someone slept on told you more than just their income. It told you their status, their beliefs, even their expectations. In noble homes, beds were massive structures, often carved from oak, wrapped in velvet or linen, and surrounded by thick curtains. These curtains weren't just for warmth. They were for performance, because in the medieval imagination, the bed was both sacred and theatrical. It was where heirs were conceived, where alliances were forged, where women died in childbirth and lords breathed their last breath. Life happened here. Death, too. When a nobleman married, the first night in bed was not always private. Witnesses, sometimes even priests, might stand nearby to bless the union, or at least confirm it occurred. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was expected. The physical act was proof of legitimacy. The bed was a contract. Now imagine trying to relax under those conditions. But not all bedding was ceremonial. In monasteries, beds were deliberately hard and cold, sometimes just wooden boards with a thin layer of straw. The idea was to remove comfort, to resist temptation, because too much softness was thought to inspire impure thoughts. Even the shape of the bed mattered. Some medieval beds were shockingly short, not because people were shorter, but because they slept half sitting, propped up by pillows or bolsters. Why? Because lying flat was associated with death. Upright sleeping was considered healthier, more spiritual, and perhaps less inviting for carnal indulgence. But if the bed was so public, so uncomfortable, how did anyone ever feel romantic? Here lies one of the great paradoxes of medieval life. Intimacy had to find a way. Maybe it was during festival nights, when ale flowed and sleeping arrangements grew looser. Maybe it was in the early morning, before the rest of the house stirred. Or maybe, in the rarest cases, it was in the hayloft, far from prying eyes, with only the sound of owls and wind through thatch. In medieval inns, strangers often shared beds. You could pay for a spot, half a mattress, a blanket if you were lucky, and find yourself curled beside someone you didn't know. It might be an old merchant, a toothless drunk, or just maybe a charming traveler. There are accounts of friendships, romances, even quick affairs sparked from nothing more than proximity. Because in the dark, in the quiet, in the exhaustion of a long journey, warmth sometimes led to more. Let's linger for a moment on the sound of a medieval night, the crackle of wood, the wind through the wooden shutters, the slow, rhythmic breathing of others beside you, and sometimes the unmistakable creak of a bed frame and all that it implied. For medieval people, there was no Netflix and chill, no scented candles, no privacy. What they had, if they were lucky, was a moment of stillness in a room of noise, and that made desire more complicated, but not impossible. By now, you might be wondering, if intimacy had so little privacy, did people still crave it the way we do? The answer is yes, but it looked very different. In many medieval households, bedding wasn't about comfort. It was survival. The act of sharing warmth during cold seasons was essential, and within that practicality, affection occasionally bloomed, but not without consequence. Let's step inside a modest merchant's home in the 14th century. A family of 6, perhaps more, tucked into a 2-room dwelling. The parents might sleep behind a wooden screen if they could afford one. Otherwise, they curled together beneath coarse blankets while children slept nearby, often in the same bed. There are court records from rural England describing young men and women being caught lying together under suspicious circumstances. But what's more fascinating than the punishment is the frequency, because proximity made opportunity. The bed, such as it was often the stage for whispered courtship. A young couple, forced by custom to be chaste, might sneak a moment in a shared sleeping space, not necessarily to consummate anything, but to brush fingers, exchange quiet words, or feel the warmth of being next to someone you weren't supposed to. These moments were dangerous, but that danger made them electric. For those who worked in service, in manors, castles, and noble houses, the sleeping arrangements were often dictated by rank. Servants sometimes slept in hallways, on straw mats, or beneath tables. If they were high-ranking, they might share a bed with others of similar status, and among them, the lines between duty and desire could blur. There are written complaints from noblewomen accusing their ladies' maids of entertaining company after dark, and sometimes the noblemen themselves were the visitors, because where there is power there is temptation, and where there is proximity there is vulnerability. We can't forget that medieval beds were also political tools. When 2 kingdoms allied through marriage, it wasn't enough for a contract to be signed. The union had to be consummated, that is, witnessed. And there are recorded cases of courtiers, bishops, and even parents being present, just beyond the curtains, as the newlyweds performed their duty. One such record comes from France, where a bishop remarked that the sheets were inspected, the sighs were heard, and the future of a dynasty was thus confirmed. It's grotesque to modern ears, but to medieval minds a bed was proof, not just of affection, but of legitimacy, alliance, and inheritance. Now, let's shift the setting once again. Picture a monastery. In these cold stone buildings, rows of monks slept in rigid silence. Their bedding was sparse, their blankets thin, and the rules were strict. Talking after lights out was forbidden. Visiting another bed? Unthinkable. But human nature doesn't obey walls. Historians have uncovered letters, confessions, even punishment records of monks who broke their vows, not with women, but with each other. These were not love stories necessarily. They were the collision of isolation, devotion, and need. In one such account from a German monastery, a monk wrote, "I prayed for strength, but the cold was deep, and so was the ache." Even in the most ascetic places, the body remained a battlefield. In village inns, where rooms were shared and beds were narrow, sleep was never truly restful. A traveler might find himself next to a stranger, and in some cases that stranger was not sleeping. There were complaints of thieves crawling into beds, of women soliciting favors, and of drunken snoring that kept everyone awake. One English law from the 15th century even fined innkeepers who allowed excessive proximity of limbs in common bedding. But how do you police dreams? We now know that where people sleep influences how they feel. And medieval people, too, experienced that strange liminality, those midnight moments between sleep and wakefulness, where fantasy and fear intertwine. Perhaps that's why many medieval love poems mention beds not as places of comfort, but of tension, the longing for space, the fear of being seen, the ache, wanting more than warmth. And yet, they also speak of joy. One 12th century French ballad describes a young woman lying beside her lover while her parents sleep nearby. The line reads, "Though the night was crowded, my heart was alone with him." That's what the bed meant for many, a temporary rebellion against the world's rules. Today, when we think of a bed, we think of solitude, of plushness, of silence. But to the medieval mind, the bed was a noisy, shared, restless place, a space where deals were made, secrets whispered, and sometimes hearts opened. And this uncomfortable, tangled, breath-warm arrangement was the foundation of all the intimacy that would follow. Because before there was love, there was a bed. And in that bed, someone was always watching. You're alone in your room. The door is shut. The lights are low. You scroll through your phone in silence, maybe glance at a clock, knowing no one is watching you. But what if someone always was? In medieval Europe, privacy, as we understand it, simply did not exist. There were no rooms of one's own, no sanctuaries behind walls. Even kings were watched when they dressed, ate, and slept. For peasants and townsfolk, the idea of being completely alone was both impractical and suspicious. Let's go back once again to the world of the common folk. A medieval peasant's house was not built for solitude. It was built for warmth, for function, for survival. Most families lived in a single-room home where the hearth, livestock, cooking, and sleeping all coexisted. The chickens clucked in the corner. Children dozed beside aging grandparents. And somewhere in the center, beneath a patchwork of blankets, two parents huddled, trying somehow to be more than just warm. Intimacy, if it happened at all, had to occur in whispers, in shadows, or under the cover of exhaustion. No locked doors, no "honey, the kids are asleep." Just the creaking floor, the scent of damp hay, and the constant awareness that someone, anyone, could be awake beside you. Even in towns where wealthier citizens could afford slightly larger homes, the arrangement was only marginally better. Walls were thin, beds were still shared, and stairs, if present, squeaked like rats. There are accounts, so many of them, of people overhearing their neighbors at night, moans, laughter, arguments, prayers. And in such a world, where everything was heard, nothing was truly secret. This lack of privacy bled into every part of life, not just the bedroom. Bathing, for example, was often public. Communal bathhouses were common throughout Europe, especially in Germany and the Low Countries. Men and women bathed together, not necessarily for intimacy, but for cleanliness and conversation. Of course, not all bathhouses were innocent. Some evolved into places of flirtation and later scandal. By the 14th century, many church authorities began condemning them as dens of sin, but they remained popular because sometimes sharing hot water was the only warmth a person got in winter. And then there's the chamber pot, a crude ceramic bowl kept under the bed or in a corner of the room, used by everyone when nature called. No flush, no scent blockers, no door to close. You relieved yourself next to the bed where your mother slept, or your cousin, or your wife. Medieval people were practical, not prudish. They didn't blush at bodily functions, but that doesn't mean they didn't crave discretion. They just rarely had the means. Let's now visit a castle. Surely you think the nobility had better arrangements. They had servants, space, and money. Surely they had privacy. But here's the truth. The higher you climbed in social rank, the more you were seen. Noble women were rarely alone. They were attended by ladies-in-waiting who dressed them, bathed them, and even helped with private matters. Noblemen, too, had pages and squires hovering around them at nearly all times. The king? The king could not even go to the toilet alone. In fact, there was an official position known as the groom of the stool, a noble who assisted the monarch during his most personal moments. His job was not only to manage the king's hygiene, but also to note down what he said during those vulnerable minutes. Because what a man says when seated in humility might reveal more than what he says at court. Intimacy then became a performance, something navigated through ritual and timing. A noble couple might have a shared bedchamber, but not necessarily for affection. In many cases they kept separate beds, even separate wings. Yet even then, nothing was guaranteed to be private. Letters were intercepted, messages read aloud, servants gossiped, and so when a nobleman wanted to meet his lover in secret, he had to be clever. There are stories of countesses hiding behind curtains, of young knights bribing guards for a moment by a lady's bedside, of queens sending coded letters with metaphors so tangled, only their intended lover could decipher them. One such letter, from a 14th century French duchess, reads, "The moonlight touched my pillow as I dreamed of figs and silk. Come before the rooster cries." Poetic, but not very secure, because at every turn someone was listening. If the Middle Ages had a motto, it might have been this: everyone is always watching, even when they weren't supposed to be. Medieval villages were tightly woven communities. People lived close together, worked side by side, and knew one another's routines down to the hour. There were no locks, no mailboxes, no tinted windows. If you disappeared for a moment, someone noticed. If your candle stayed lit too long after dark, someone talked. This wasn't always malicious. In a world without police, neighbors were your security system. But that closeness meant that even your most personal moments had witnesses, and some of them reported you. In England, for instance, the church ran special courts called Ecclesiastical courts, which handled matters of morality. These courts dealt with fornication, adultery, and even rumors of inappropriate proximity. They didn't need hard evidence. A neighbor's word could be enough. One woman in Norwich was fined for lying with her betrothed before their wedding night, after her neighbor reported hearing suspicious sounds. Her response? The walls are thin. What they heard was laughter. But the church disagreed, because in the medieval world, your bed wasn't yours alone. It belonged to God, to the village, and to the expectations of your station. There were even rules about when couples could be intimate. The church forbade lovemaking on Sundays, holy days, during Lent, Advent, and nearly half the calendar. And heaven help you if a festival was coming up, because even that could be considered too sacred for such fleshly distractions. Some historians have joked that medieval couples had about 80 safe days a year for intimacy, and even those were frowned upon if done with too much enthusiasm. So what did people do? They found ways. In rural areas, lovers sometimes escaped to the hayloft, far from the eyes of their parents and priests. The soft straw and muffled acoustics made it a favorite setting for midnight rendezvous. But even this came with risks. A misstep could snap a board. A candle could set the loft ablaze. And worst of all, someone might follow. Court records from the 13th century mention a young man who lured his sweetheart to the barn, only for her brother to leap from the shadows with a club. The brother was fined. The lovers were reprimanded. But all three were, in the end, seen by the village and remembered. In cities, privacy was even harder to come by. Tenants lived shoulder to shoulder. Rooms were subdivided, and noises traveled fast. There's an infamous record from Paris where two apprentices were evicted after keeping the household awake with ungodly rhythm. The landlady described it as like oxen trampling the floorboards. Even inns, as mentioned before, weren't spared. Travelers shared beds, sometimes with complete strangers. One guest wrote that he awoke to find a foot in my ribs and a breath like garlic in my face, followed by a giggle that was not my own. And then, of course, there were the monasteries, places meant for silence, for solitude, for denial of the flesh. But desire doesn't vanish behind stone walls. Some monks carved secret passages between cells. Some nuns were caught sneaking out at night, their habits tucked under cloaks. In one Italian convent, the abbess herself was tried for welcoming visitors after Vespers. Her defense? I merely offered hospitality. But the visitors, men in armor, arriving well after dark, suggested otherwise. Even royalty was not immune. When Queen Isabella of France gave birth, she was not alone. A room full of courtiers, midwives, and even political advisors stood nearby. This wasn't just for help. It was to witness, to confirm the baby's legitimacy. And just as birth was public, so too could be the act that preceded it. Some noble marriages required a public bedding ceremony where witnesses watched the bride and groom enter the bedchamber, sometimes tucking them in as a symbolic gesture. In extreme cases, they stayed nearby, just beyond the curtain, to ensure the deed was done. It's one thing to perform love, another to perform it with an audience. And yet, this was the reality for many. So when did privacy begin? Not truly until much later, when architecture changed, when locks became common, when rooms had single purposes instead of many. Only then did the idea of a personal, sealed-off space take hold. But in the medieval world, You were never alone. Not really. Not when you ate, not when you bathed, not when you loved. You existed in a world of watchful eyes, and every shadow you thought protected you had ears. So the next time you close your bedroom door and turn off the light, know this: you are experiencing a luxury most of history never knew. A moment that is yours alone. And in that silence, in that space that belongs only to you, perhaps you'll sleep a little easier. You might think of marriage today as a choice between two people, a declaration of love, a shared dream. But in medieval Europe, marriage was rarely about love. It was about power, land, obedience, and, above all, morality. The Church called it a holy sacrament, a divine union. But it was also a battlefield, one where desire, duty, and dogma collided in a tangle of expectations that shaped every bed, every birth, and every whispered, "I do." Let's begin not in a castle, but in a village. Two peasants, a man and a woman, stand before a priest. They have no rings, no white dress, no choir. Perhaps they exchanged vows under a tree, or in front of neighbors, or in the fields during a pause in the harvest. That was all it took. For much of the medieval period, consensual words spoken in the present tense, what historians call per verba depraesenti, were enough to form a valid marriage. I take you as my wife, and I take you as my husband. No priest needed, no document signed. Of course, the Church didn't like that. By the 12th century, clergy began insisting that marriage was too sacred to be left to the people. It needed oversight, regulation, witnesses, control. And so began a centuries-long campaign to pull the marital bed firmly into the hands of the Church. But people resisted. They married in secret. They eloped. They whispered vows behind barns, sometimes just to secure a moment of passion before the harvest ended. This led to chaos. Women claiming they were wives. Men denying they ever married. Parents outraged when daughters vanished with husbands who never returned. And so, by the 13th century, the Church created stricter rules. Banns must be read in advance. Weddings must be public. Priests must preside. Marriage, once a whispered promise, became a public contract. And once you were married, the rules began. The Church dictated when couples could share a bed. As you've heard, nearly half the calendar was off limits. Lent, Advent, feast days, fast days, Wednesdays, Fridays, Sundays, the eve of communion, and more. Too much affection was considered sinful, especially if it was pleasurable. Yes, pleasure was a problem. Marital intimacy was allowed, but only if it was open to procreation. Theologians wrote long, painful treatises debating how couples could lie together without sinning. The key? No passion, no enjoyment, just duty. In other words, you could love your spouse, but you couldn't want them too much. Let's turn to one of the most famous voices on the matter, St. Augustine. He believed that lust, even within marriage, was dangerous, that the shiver of pleasure during intimacy was a sign of human weakness, that even a husband and wife could fall into mortal sin if they enjoyed the act too much. His words shaped doctrine for centuries. Another thinker, Thomas Aquinas, agreed. He classified acts of intimacy by their level of corruption. Anything that didn't result in a child or involved too much novelty was suspect. Even certain positions were frowned upon. Yes, really. To be clear, the Church didn't forbid affection entirely. Husbands and wives could live together, care for each other, even sleep in the same bed. But they were expected to restrain their urges, to model spiritual discipline, and to prioritize reproduction over romance. And if they didn't, confession awaited. Medieval confession manuals are fascinating documents. They include detailed questions for priests to ask married couples. Questions about frequency, about desire, about creativity. One 14th century manual instructs priests to ask, "Have you loved your wife too much, seeking her body when it was not lawful?" Imagine being asked that by your parish priest. It gets stranger. In some regions, bishops organized visitation campaigns where they sent officials door to door to check on the moral health of households. These officials asked neighbors about the behavior of married couples. Did they argue? Did they separate beds? Were there rumors of infidelity? A husband who left his wife's bed too often could be accused of neglect. A wife who dressed too finely might be accused of seduction. Even laughter in the night could be cause for suspicion. Marriage, in short, was everyone's business, and for women, the stakes were even higher. Once married, a woman's body was no longer her own. The law called it the marital debt, a duty to provide access to her husband. Refusing could lead to legal complaints. In some cases, courts ordered wives to return to their husbands' beds under threat of punishment. This wasn't affection. This was obligation. But strangely, the rules cut both ways. A husband, too, could be found guilty of denying his wife intimacy. The church believed both spouses owed one another the debt, and if a man refused to fulfill his role, the wife could seek annulment, or worse, expose his impotence publicly. One case from 15th century France records a woman who demanded a trial by inspection. A panel of matrons examined her husband. Their conclusion? He was unfit for union. The marriage was dissolved. No pressure, right? If you think modern marriages are complex, spare a thought for the medieval couple who met on their wedding day. Because in the world of arranged unions, love came later, if it came at all. Marriage among the upper classes wasn't a romance. It was a transaction, a deal struck between families, sometimes when the bride and groom were still children. The goal? Consolidate land, secure alliances, increase dowries, and, in many cases, control bloodlines. A nobleman might marry off his daughter to a distant cousin, not for affection, but for access to a river, a vineyard, or a border fortress. And once the contract was signed, the couple had no choice. In one account from the 14th century, a girl of just 12 was wed to a baron 3 times her age. She wrote in her diary, "I saw him only once before the church, and after, he smelled of wet fur." Love was not guaranteed, but obedience was, and once married, consummation was expected immediately. In fact, there was often a formal ceremony, the bedding ritual, in which family members led the bride and groom to the bed, sometimes even offering advice, prayers, or jokes along the way. In the most extreme cases, guests lingered nearby to ensure the union was completed, not witnessed in the flesh perhaps, but confirmed with stained sheets or satisfied sighs. Because a marriage that wasn't consummated could be annulled. Which brings us to a key medieval paradox. Marriage was sacred, yet dissolvable, under very specific conditions. Infertility, impotence, or failure to consummate were among the few acceptable reasons to end a marriage. But proving these claims required public humiliation, medical inspections, sworn testimony from household staff. In one German village, a husband accused of inability was brought before the court, disrobed, and given warm wine in front of officials to test his resolve. He failed. His wife was granted freedom, But let's return to those who stayed married and didn't love each other. What did they do? They endured. Some turned to religion, others to drink. Some noble women poured their passion into poetry or letters, writing to far-off lovers, to dead husbands, or to no one at all. A few had affairs, though this was risky and often punished harshly if discovered. But many couples, especially among the working classes, found a quiet companionship. They raised children, managed farms, shared bread, and over time, perhaps even affection. Still, the marital bed remained a space of regulation, and many went to great lengths to avoid it. There are stories of women feigning illness for months to postpone intimacy. Others claimed visions, taking temporary vows of chastity as a form of delay. One woman in Italy told her husband she was haunted by a saint who demanded purity for 40 nights. He believed her. Men, too, dodged expectations. A merchant in Flanders claimed that his work required him to sleep in the warehouse to guard the grain. His wife later testified that he hadn't touched her in 6 years. The court fined him and ordered him home. There were also more inventive methods: herbal concoctions, cold baths, extended pilgrimages. One couple allegedly forgot to consummate their marriage for 2 years, believing that intimacy was forbidden until after a special blessing. The priest, when informed, simply sighed, because despite all the doctrine and dogma, people still fumbled their way through desire. Let's not forget, most medieval people weren't saints or sinners. They were simply trying to survive under a church that saw every action as a potential sin and a society that placed honor in restraint. And yet, in the midst of all this control, love still surfaced. There are letters from husbands to wives filled with tenderness. "I miss your hands in the cold," one man wrote. "I sleep beside the fire and dream of the way you said my name." Another, from a soldier on campaign: "The priest says I must not think of you, but I do, and I do." These fragments tell us what the church tried to suppress, that even in arranged unions, even in loveless homes, intimacy had a stubborn way of breaking through. And sometimes love was found after the vows. There's a tale from Yorkshire of a couple married for obligation who later fell for each other slowly, over shared chores, whispered laughter, and the warmth of long winters. After 15 years, the husband carved a new bed frame as a gift. On it he etched, "Not bought, but built." Not bought, but built. That was the secret to surviving marriage under the church's grip. You followed the rules, yes, but you also found small, quiet ways to reclaim yourself, to hold a hand in darkness, to look across the table and smile, to make something sacred, even if no one believed you could. Close your eyes for a moment. Now imagine that every fleeting desire, every secret urge, every unspoken fantasy was not only known, but judged, not just by your neighbor or your priest, but by God Himself. In the medieval world, your thoughts were never fully your own. To feel lust was a danger. To act on it, a crime. And even to dream of pleasure could damn your soul. This was the spiritual terrain of medieval Europe, where pleasure was policed, desire was a demon, and the body itself, especially the body in heat, was seen as both a curse and a temptation. Let's begin where all forbidden things tend to start, in the mind. Medieval theologians believed that thoughts had weight, that sin began not with action, but with imagination. If your heart wandered, your body would surely follow. So they taught that to desire sinfully was to sin already. That meant a lustful glance, a wandering daydream, or a longing sigh could all be enough to condemn you. Monks and priests wrote long treatises cataloging dangerous thoughts. One such guide warned that a man who stares too long at a woman's ankle may wake in the night with impure dreams, and those dreams shall stain his soul. That's not metaphor. They meant it literally, because to them the erotic dream was a battleground, a place where the devil planted seeds of ruin. The wet dream, the involuntary moan, the unconscious stirring beneath the blanket, these were not seen as accidents of biology, but as tests of faith. Young men were instructed to sleep on hard boards, to avoid warmth, to drink cold water, and avoid meat before bed, all in an effort to suppress the beast within. And the beast had a name, concupiscentia, the craving of the flesh. Church writers described it as a fire that burned in the loins and muddied the soul. They believed that even Adam, after the fall, had been cursed with this lust. That original sin lived not only in disobedience, but in the groin. And so, the body became a prison. Let's visit a monastery. A young monk, newly arrived, writes in his journal, "I cannot look at Brother Peter's lips. I pray and I bite my own. Last night I dreamt of a woman I have never seen. Her hair smelled of fire. I awoke ashamed, and yet I lingered in the warmth of the dream." This confession, though anonymous, is one of thousands. Records survive of monks flagellating themselves after impure dreams, beating their backs raw with cords soaked in vinegar. Some would fast for days. Others would walk barefoot in the snow, hoping pain would cleanse their mind. Even thinking about pleasure could lead to agony. Outside the cloister, in the everyday world, temptations were everywhere. At the marketplace, the tavern, the festival, a bare wrist, a glimpse of collarbone, a laugh too bright. These simple things stirred hearts and alarmed souls. Sermons warned women not to wear their hair loose, not to sing in public, not to lace their dresses too tight, because a man's fall might begin with her smile. Of course, this wasn't about fairness. It was about fear. Men feared their own desires, so they controlled women's appearance. Even the act of bathing was considered dangerous, not because of the water, but because the sight of skin might awaken thoughts best left asleep. In one parish, a priest wrote, "A wife who exposes her shoulder to her husband before Mass may cause his thoughts to stray from the Holy Spirit." Imagine living with that pressure. Now imagine you're a young woman. You have no control over your marriage, no private space, and suddenly you feel something, an ache, a curiosity, a desire that has no name in your language. You mention it to a midwife, perhaps, or whisper it in confession, and what do you hear in return? That it is unnatural, that it is sin, that it must be extinguished. Because medieval society had little room for female pleasure. Yes, it existed. Yes, it was felt, but it was rarely spoken of. The medical belief of the time, influenced by ancient Roman texts, claimed that women's bodies were cold and passive, that they received but did not crave, that only men experienced true lust, and when women did, it was either demonic or a sign of witchcraft. Let that sink in. Pleasure in a woman could be proof of sorcery, and many women paid the price. In trial records from the 15th century, we find countless accusations where a woman's sexual behavior, real or imagined, was used as evidence against her. One was accused of seducing married men with potions and sighs. Another was said to have danced under the moon with no clothes. A third was tried for causing dreams in boys. All of them were punished. Some were burned. Desire was not just forbidden, it was fatal. If the medieval world was obsessed with suppressing pleasure, it was equally obsessed with imagining it, because even as priests warned of lust, poets sang of it. Even as theologians condemned desire, merchants sold remedies for it. And even as women were punished for their longing, they whispered to each other of ways to feel more or feel less. This contradiction between control and craving shaped a secret world of forbidden pleasures. Let's start with one of the strangest survivors of that world, the love manuals. Yes, you read that right. Hidden among the dusty medical texts and religious tracts of medieval libraries are illustrated manuscripts, often handwritten, containing advice on intimacy, attraction, and yes, technique. Some were copied from ancient sources like Ovid. Others were written in the margins of anatomy books, disguised as medical notes. One such book, found in Italy, included diagrams of ideal lovers, descriptions of positions favorable for conception, and even herbal recipes for increasing desire. It was intended for physicians. But let's be honest, not every reader had healing on their mind. Another French manuscript, written entirely in riddles, described the female body as a castle with secret doors, and spoke of a key made not of iron, but of flame. It was both poetic and unmistakably carnal. These books were rare, expensive, often hidden, but they remind us that even in the most repressive times, knowledge finds a way. So did magic. Throughout Europe, people turned to love potions and charms, a blend of folk tradition, herbalism, and superstition, to stir desire or soothe it. A woman might steep rose petals, saffron, and cinnamon in wine, then whisper her lover's name before serving it. A man might carry a piece of his beloved's hair in a pouch, tied close to his heart. Was it effective? Who knows? But belief alone had power. Of course, the church despised such practices. They saw them as pagan leftovers, invitations to sin, or worse, deals with the devil. And in many places, love magic was a punishable offense. In 1477, a woman in Cologne was accused of placing an enchanted apple under a man's bed to make him dream of her until he woke in love. She was imprisoned. The apple was burned. But the dreams? Those could not be unmade. And dreams, more than any potion, were where the forbidden flourished. Medieval literature is full of tales where desire creeps in through sleep. In one English poem, a young knight dreams of a lady who undresses slowly beneath a silver moon. He awakes in shame and longing. Another story tells of a widow who dreams of a visiting monk and wakes to find her bed disturbed by invisible hands. These stories were circulated as warnings, but they were also fantasies, because even as the church condemned desire, it never quite managed to extinguish it. In taverns, in brothels, in marketplaces, people looked, they touched, they whispered, and they invented small ways to break the rules. A lowered hood, a secret glance, a festival night when the ale flowed too freely and the watchman looked the other way. Carnival, especially, became a season of reversal. During these days the world turned upside down. Men dressed as women, priests danced, villagers kissed strangers in the streets, and all the rules, just for a moment, went quiet. And in that silence the body remembered itself. Even in cloisters, pleasure had its own secret tongue. There are accounts of nuns writing love poetry, not always to men, but sometimes to each other. Tender lines of devotion, longing, and barely disguised hunger. In one letter from a 15th century convent, a sister writes, "I have tasted the fruit of your gaze, and I am bruised for it. Was it spiritual? Erotic? Both?" The line between divine and desire was often thin, and the Church knew it. That's why mystics like Hildegard of Bingen or Bernard of Clairvaux used the language of rapture to describe communion with God. They spoke of burning, of aching, of surrendering the self to something larger. The imagery, though religious, was deeply, unmistakably sensual. The body was supposed to be a temple, but temples have echoing chambers, and sometimes the echoes were not prayers. Of course, not all who sought pleasure survived. Many were punished, publicly, brutally. A woman caught with a lover could be shorn, paraded through the streets, or locked in a pillory. A man who seduced a married woman might be flogged, exiled, or forced into a marriage he did not want. And those accused of unnatural desires, especially same-sex love, faced even worse. Records from the Inquisition are filled with confessions taken under torture. Men who admitted to dreams, women who admitted to touch. Most were condemned. Few were forgiven. And yet, the desire never stopped, because you can burn books, you can break bodies, but you can't kill longing. Not then, not now. In the end, medieval people were just that, people with hearts that raced, eyes that wandered, and minds that imagined. Even if the world around them whispered, "Don't." Even if the church said, "Sin." Even if their very thoughts could be used as evidence, they still desired, quietly, desperately, defiantly. And in doing so, they kept the oldest fire burning, not in hearths, but in hearts. If you think modern dating has rules, left swipe, right swipe, don't text too soon, wait 3 days, imagine a world where the wrong touch, the wrong union, or even the wrong last name could land you in court. Or worse, in chains. In medieval Europe, intimacy wasn't just about chemistry. It was about class, kinship, and control, because not everyone was allowed to sleep with everyone. In fact, most people weren't. Let's start with the most rigid barrier of all, social class. You, a peasant farmer's daughter, fall in love with a charming young squire. He smiles at you by the well, leaves you a dried flower tucked in your basket. For a moment, you believe he might choose you. But that moment ends the second his family finds out. Why? Because marrying down, or even touching down, was often seen as a betrayal of blood. Nobles were expected to marry other nobles, merchants, other merchants, peasants, stayed with peasants. The hierarchy wasn't just economic, it was biological. People believed that blood carried honor, and that sleeping with someone beneath you would stain your lineage. Even if the two lovers consented, the law did not. There are court cases of noble sons imprisoned for lying with maidservants, of wealthy widows stripped of inheritance for marrying men of unclean stock, and of course, countless tales, half legend, half truth, of lords who seduced village girls and vanished, leaving scandal and shame behind. And what of the girls? They often bore the greater cost. A peasant woman who fell pregnant by a nobleman rarely found justice. In some cases, she was labeled a temptress. In others, her child was declared illegitimate, unable to inherit anything from the father. One such case in 14th century Flanders describes a nobleman who confessed to bedding a miller's daughter in a moment of wine and music. He offered to pay a fine, but refused to name the child. The girl, meanwhile, was branded and forced to leave the village. Even desire had a price tag. But social class was only one barrier. There was also family. You couldn't marry, or sleep with, someone too closely related. Seems obvious, right? But the medieval church took it further. Way further. By the 11th century, canon law banned marriages within 7 degrees of consanguinity. That's basically seventh cousins. And not just by blood. Spiritual kinship counted too. If someone had baptized your child or shared a godparent, that could also block marriage. Imagine having to draw a family tree for half the village before proposing. The rule was so extreme that at one point over half of all marriages in Europe could be considered illegal under church law. Eventually, the ban was reduced to 4 degrees. Still absurd by today's standards, but enforcement varied. In villages, people often ignored the rules, especially when the pickings were slim. If you lived in a town of 300 people, avoiding cousins wasn't easy. And so, many marriages happened anyway, and were quietly blessed later. Others sought papal dispensations, essentially, get-out-of-jail-free cards from the Pope. Nobles used them often, especially when dynastic marriages between cousins were politically useful. One of the most infamous? Eleanor of Aquitaine married her cousin, King Louis VII of France. The Pope approved. But when the marriage soured, the consanguinity rule came roaring back. They were too closely related, the court declared. It must be annulled. A convenient loophole, used when convenient. Then came religious boundaries. In Christian Europe, interfaith unions were usually forbidden. A Christian couldn't legally marry a Jew or a Muslim without conversion. And even conversion didn't always solve things. Jewish communities often resisted intermarriage just as strongly, if not more, fearing the loss of tradition and identity. There were darker consequences, too. In some towns, rumors of forbidden unions between Christian girls and Jewish men were enough to spark violence. In one case, in 1290, England, a Jewish physician was executed after being accused, without evidence, of seducing a noblewoman. His body was left hanging as a warning. Love in such cases wasn't just forbidden, it was fatal. And of course there were the laws of celibacy. If you were a monk, nun, priest, or novice, you weren't supposed to sleep with anyone. Period. But, as we've seen, vows don't always silence hearts. Letters survive from young women in convents who fell in love with visiting priests, from monks who confessed to secret meetings with lay people. In one monastery, a hidden tunnel led from the cellar to the nearby village. It was discovered after 2 monks disappeared, and reappeared 9 months later with a baby. The church, horrified, launched an inquiry. The men were defrocked. The tunnel was bricked up, but local villagers continued to whisper, "The walls may close, but the body opens." And that's the truth of it. Because no matter how many rules existed, people found ways to bend them. Rules are rules, until they're not. Because in the medieval world, who you were often mattered more than what you did. While peasants and townsfolk were dragged into court for lying with the wrong person, the rich and powerful often bent the same rules and walked away untouched. Let's talk about the nobility. It was an open secret that many lords and kings kept mistresses. These women were not wives, and yet they often lived in the castle, received gifts, bore children, and sometimes wielded quiet political influence. Their relationships were, by church standards, sinful, adulterous, even scandalous. and yet they were tolerated. Why? Because the men involved had power. King Edward III of England had a mistress named Alice Perrers, who was so influential, people accused her of speaking in Parliament through him. King Charles VI of France had multiple official favorites, each housed in their own lavish wing. Even popes, yes, popes, were rumored to keep secret lovers. One chronicler wrote bitterly, "The church forbids the flesh to peasants, but not to princes." That wasn't just poetic. It was true. If you were poor and slept with someone forbidden, you might be whipped, fined, or publicly humiliated. But if you were rich, your sins were regrettable, perhaps mortal, but not always punished. Double standards were everywhere. There were even legal exemptions for some nobles. In parts of France, local lords held the infamous droit du seigneur, the so-called right of the first night, a supposed law allowing them to sleep with a newlywed peasant bride before her husband could. Historians debate whether this was ever truly legal, but the myth alone tells us something chilling, that people believed it could happen, and that belief carried weight. In one 14th century village, a miller was accused of refusing his lord's ancient rites. The case collapsed in court, but not before the bride's family fled the town. That's the power of rumor, of social hierarchy, of fear. Then there were the gendered double standards. A woman who slept with the wrong man could lose everything: reputation, inheritance, marriage prospects. But a man? He might be forgiven with a fine, a confession, or even just a shrug. Medieval ballads often celebrated roguish men, the lusty knight, the wandering troubadour, the merchant who boasted of conquests. But women were expected to remain chaste, pure, untouched. One wrong move, and she was labeled forever. Strumpet, harlot, fallen, even if she was coerced, even if she was in love, even if he promised to marry her. There were legal remedies, yes. A woman could bring suit for broken marriage vows or seduction under false pretenses. But the burden of proof was high, and her word, without witnesses, was often not enough. So many endured in silence. And yet, in the shadows of these restrictions, people kept finding each other. There are letters between lovers signed only with initials, poems hidden beneath floorboards, messages smuggled in baskets of bread. One peasant girl in 15th century Bohemia carved her name and her lover's into the beams of a church roof, a place no one would look unless they were fixing the tiles. Their initials are still there, and sometimes the forbidden turned into legend. In Spain, a noblewoman fell in love with her Moorish tutor. When discovered, she was locked in a tower, he banished. But for years she sang to the birds each dawn the same melody he had once played on his lute. Locals began calling the birds the mourner's choir. The tower still stands, because no rule, no matter how strict, could stop a heart from reaching out. Let's not forget, too, the queer love stories the church tried to erase. Men who fell in love with men, women who found solace in each other's arms. Their stories are harder to trace, hidden in code, buried in trial records, erased from public memory. But they existed. We know of a monk in 13th century England who was exiled after being caught writing love poems to a fellow brother. Of two women in southern France who lived as sisters for decades, sharing land, labor, and one bed. Of a priest in Rome who confessed to laying his heart before another's hands, refusing to name the person. Were they punished? Often, yes. But they also loved, and that love, forbidden though it was, has echoed through time. So what can we learn from all these rules? That they were less about protecting souls and more about preserving power, that they were written by those at the top, enforced on those at the bottom, and broken, quietly, by nearly everyone in between, and that even in the most rigid society, the human heart remained unruly. It whispered across walls. It reached through class. It defied the family tree. It risked ruin for a single night or a lifetime of closeness. Because love, lust, longing, they don't ask permission. They simply arrive. And in the medieval world, when they did, the rules trembled. Let's be honest. When you think of medieval intimacy, the first image that pops into your mind probably isn't candlelight and silk sheets. It's the smell. Because beneath the romance and rituals, beneath the church rules and whispered desires, there was another reality to medieval love, the human body, unfiltered, unwashed, often unpleasant. In a world without deodorant, flush toilets, or regular laundry, getting close to someone meant getting close to everything they carried and everything they didn't clean. Let's start at the beginning, the bath. Contrary to popular myth, medieval people didn't completely avoid bathing. In fact, many enjoyed it. Towns had public bathhouses, nobles had private tubs, and there were recipes for rose-scented soaps and oils dating back to the 13th century. But here's the problem: access and frequency. For peasants, especially in rural villages, bathing was rare. Water had to be drawn from a well, carried home, and heated over a fire. In winter, it was freezing. In summer, shared. So most people bathed once a week, if that. Some only for festivals or holidays. And when they did, it wasn't a long soak. It was a quick rinse in reused water, often shared with siblings or neighbors. Privacy was non-existent. Cleanliness, relative. Your lover, then, might come to your bed smelling of sweat, smoke, livestock, and the same tunic worn for days. And yet, people still desired. Now imagine the mouth. Dental hygiene was primitive at best. Toothbrushes, as we know them, didn't exist. People cleaned their teeth with rags, salt, ashes, or even sticks. Mouthwash was sometimes made from wine or vinegar. But tooth decay was rampant. Breath was rarely fresh. One 14th century physician wrote, "To kiss with an open mouth is to court the devil's breath." Romantic, isn't it? But it didn't stop couples from kissing, from whispering, from getting close, because medieval people were accustomed to smells. Their threshold was different. What we consider foul, they considered normal. Sweat meant labor. Dirt meant life. A bit of animal dung on your boots was just Tuesday. Even the nobility, with access to perfumes and linen, couldn't escape the natural odor of the world they lived in. Let's talk about clothing. Undergarments were few. Men wore linen braies, a kind of loose shorts. Women wore shifts. These absorbed sweat but were rarely washed thoroughly, especially in winter. Heavy outer garments were brushed, not laundered, and under all those layers heat gathered. So did fleas and lice. Yes, even among nobles. There are documented cases of queens being combed for nits by their ladies-in-waiting, of kings keeping special combs to clear their beards of vermin. Lice were so common, there were poems written about them. Now imagine undressing someone, knowing their shift might carry guests. Still, passion persisted. Then there was hair. Women rarely cut it. In some regions, a married woman's hair was considered too seductive to show, so it was braided, wrapped, or hidden beneath veils. But at night, in private, hair could be unbound, flowing, sensual, and tangled. There are medieval guides advising couples to brush the beloved's hair before lying together, both to express affection and to check for lice. Not exactly a hallmark moment. Let's move on to health. Injuries were common. So were infections. Most people had cuts, bruises, missing teeth, or skin conditions. The labor of daily life, plowing, spinning, grinding grain, hauling water, left its mark. And then there were illnesses, rashes, boils, fungus. People lived with untreated infections for weeks, sometimes years. The smell of rot, the sight of sores, all were part of life, and sometimes part of love. In one account, a woman described her husband's body as nicked and knotted, but strong. She said she loved him more for each scar, because each one proved he stayed. Tenderness, even in filth. But let's not pretend it was easy. There were real dangers to intimacy, not just from disease, but from pregnancy, which was risky, even deadly. Childbirth killed many women. Some men feared it too, not for themselves, but for what it meant. More mouths to feed, more risk of death, more pain for someone they cared about. So some couples avoided intimacy out of fear. Others turned to herbal contraception, risky, unreliable, but used. Pennyroyal, mugwort, and wild carrot were known for their abortifacient properties. Midwives kept secrets, so did wives. And through it all, the body was a mystery. Without modern science, medieval people had strange ideas about how their bodies worked. They believed in humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Balance between these fluids determined health and temperament. Too much blood, you were lustful. Too much phlegm, you were cold. And passion, that was heat rising, dangerous if left unchecked. So to love someone was also to risk imbalance, to risk illness, to risk sin. And yet, people did it anyway. Let's return to a simple, forgotten truth of medieval love. Everyone smelled, not in a derogatory way, but in a very human one. Sweat, earth, wood smoke, iron, leather, milk, ale. These were the natural colognes of the age. There were no showers, no body sprays, no floral detergents. What lingered on the skin was life itself, and people learned to navigate desire through it. In fact, scent mattered. Some believed that the way a person smelled could influence attraction, that certain body odors revealed compatibility or warned against it. In a time before perfume was common, a woman might tuck dried herbs into her bodice to release a faint scent when she moved. A man might rub rosemary on his wrists before visiting a lover, not to mask the natural odor, but to mix with it. Because in the medieval world, your smell was part of your soul, and strangely, the absence of modern hygiene sometimes created a deeper kind of intimacy. Imagine undressing someone slowly, not out of impatience, but necessity. Layer by layer, undoing knots, lifting wool, peeling linen, feeling the warmth of their skin rise beneath the fabric, brushing aside hair tangled by the day's labor, hands rough with calluses tracing the curve of a familiar body. In that moment, smell wasn't the enemy. It was recognition, memory, proof that the person before you was alive, real, human. Medieval love was not sterile, it was textured. Now, let's talk about skin. You might think of smoothness, softness, polish. But for most medieval people, skin was weathered, tanned by sun, cracked by cold, scraped from chores. Hands were rough, elbows dry, knees bruised. Yet none of that stopped touch. In fact, Some medieval texts describe coarse skin as a virtue, a sign of hard work, of honesty, of truth. One farmer wrote in a love letter, "I miss the grip of your hand. It is stronger than any prayer." Even nobles weren't immune. Despite their silks and balms, they still rode horses, hunted in rain, and walked through smoke-filled halls. A princess might have pearls in her hair, but soot on her cheeks. That contrast, it made them human. And there's something else. The symbolism of washing. In medieval stories, to bathe someone was often an act of devotion. Knights returned from war were washed by their ladies. Brides were bathed by their mothers before the wedding night. Even religious rituals, like foot washing, carried erotic undertones when performed in private. Cleanliness, then, wasn't just about hygiene, it was intimacy through care. You scrubbed the grime from someone's back not because it offended you, but because it connected you. Because it said, "I see you, I accept you, and I will tend to the body that carries you." Medieval physicians understood this, in their own strange way. One 13th century doctor recommended gentle stroking of the back and belly with scented oil to encourage marital harmony. Another advised couples to share warm cloths in winter, rubbing each other's limbs to prevent chills and ignite affection. The act of cleansing could be foreplay, and yet danger always lurked. Wounds could fester, teeth could rot, diseases like syphilis, leprosy, or the French pox, as it was later called, spread quietly, visibly, and terribly. Without germ theory, people blamed hot blood, curses, or divine punishment. There were treatments, herbs, poultices, bloodletting, but little real understanding. Still, they tried. A woman might press lavender to her lover's chest. A man might crush garlic into wine and offer it as protection. A midwife might burn rosemary under the bed to chase away illness. Whether it worked or not, it meant something. Because love, in the Middle Ages, was not abstract. It lived in labor, in effort, in tending wounds, in combing hair, in cleaning feet swollen from work. Even the erotic was rooted in reality. Consider this scene, written in a 14th century romance. She removed his boots and laughed at his socks, soaked from the field. He blushed, but she touched his calves and said, "A man with muddy legs is a man who feeds others." Then she kissed the dirt from his knee. That isn't perfume and petals. That's real. Love in medieval times wasn't about flawless bodies. It was about forgiveness of the flesh, the acceptance of scars, of smells, of sweat. To lie with someone wasn't to pretend they were clean. It was to know completely that they were not, and to choose them anyway. So the next time you imagine a medieval couple embracing, don't imagine the fantasy. Imagine the cracked hands, the heavy air, the ache of the back after labor, the warmth of two people huddled, not for passion, but for survival, and finding passion there anyway. That was medieval intimacy, not pristine, but profound. What did it mean to love someone in the Middle Ages? Was it sacred or sinful? A gift from heaven? Or a temptation from hell? To us, love might seem like a personal emotion, a spark between two people. But in the medieval world, love was a puzzle wrapped in theology, myth, and fear. Everyone wanted it. Everyone was warned about it. And no one could quite agree what it was. Let's start with the church. According to medieval theologians, love had two faces. One was divine, pure, chaste, selfless. The other, carnal, selfish, dangerous. The first kind was caritas, charity, love of God, of community, of duty. The second was cupiditous, desire, lust, hunger of the flesh, and the church spent centuries warning people not to confuse the two. Falling in love, they said, might lead you closer to God or straight into sin. To love your spouse dutifully, to raise children, to support each other in virtue, that was good. To crave your partner's body too much, to lose sleep over their voice or smile, that was suspect. Even within marriage, the line was thin. One priest wrote, "He who desires his wife as he did before marriage sins within the bond." In other words, even desire for your lawful spouse could be sinful if it burned too hot. But outside the pulpit, something else was blooming. Courtly love. Ah, yes. The songs, the poems, the stories of knights and ladies, of secret letters and stolen glances. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a whole philosophy. Born in the courts of 12th century southern France, courtly love turned the church's ideas on their head. Where religion said desire is danger, the troubadours said desire is beauty. In these tales a noble knight pledges his heart to a lady, usually married, usually unattainable. He performs brave deeds to win her favor. She offers him a glove, a look, a word. Sometimes nothing more. Their love burns not in the bed, but in the longing, in the ache. Because in this version of love, consummation isn't the goal. Torment is. The more impossible the love, the more noble the heart. Strange? Absolutely. But medieval people found this idea intoxicating. It gave them a way to express passion without scandal, to feel deeply without falling from grace, to write poems that said everything they couldn't say aloud. One troubadour, Bernard de Ventadorn, wrote, "When she speaks, the air bends to listen. When she sleeps, my soul leaves my body. Her hand, never touched, has unmade me." This wasn't just flattery. It was a spiritual obsession, and for many it was safer than real love, because real love meant real risk of pregnancy, disgrace, punishment. But poetry? That could soar. Of course, not everyone lived in castles and wrote verses. For peasants and townsfolk, love was more practical, but still full of dreams. Folk tales across Europe speak of poor boys winning the hearts of millers' daughters, of clever girls outwitting jealous rivals, of true love recognized by fate, a broken shoe, a matching birthmark, a dream shared across miles. And then there were love charms. Yes, again. From the forests of Germany to the fields of Wales, people carried tokens to stir affection or test devotion. A woman might bake a small figure of dough and burn it over herbs, whispering a man's name. A man might place a coin beneath a woman's doorstep to see if she dreamed of him. Some believed that if two lovers slept with a thread tied between their wrists, their hearts would beat in time. Others carved initials into apples and buried them beneath the moon. Was it magic, or just a way to make the mysterious feel possible? Either way, love in the Middle Ages wasn't just felt. It was worked for, and it wasn't always mutual. One-sided longing, what we'd call unrequited love, was deeply romanticized. To pine, to ache, to suffer. That was proof of sincerity. A 13th century English ballad begins, "She loves me not, yet still I die. My heart is hung on her pale eye, and if she frowns the wind is cold, and if she smiles the sun is gold." To modern ears this sounds dramatic, but to a medieval audience it was ideal. Because in a world where most marriages were arranged, choosing your sorrow felt like power. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't just an emotion. It was a force, one that could elevate the soul or destroy the body. It was unpredictable, dangerous, holy, foolish, poetic, terrifying, and sometimes a literal illness. Yes, illness. Doctors in the medieval world believed in a condition called amor herios, love sickness. It was recognized in medical texts, treated by physicians, and feared as much as any fever. The symptoms? Sleeplessness, loss of appetite, rapid heartbeat, daydreaming, obsession, weakness, sudden sighing. In some cases, hallucinations. If a person pined too long for someone unattainable, their humors were thought to fall out of balance. They might grow pale, emaciated, even die. This wasn't just poetic metaphor. It was diagnosed like the flu. One medical guide from 1325 recommends treating love sickness with diversion, music, cool baths, and in extreme cases, union with the beloved. Others advised against allowing the sufferer to sleep too long or remain indoors, lest the fantasies worsen. In rare cases, love sickness was treated with herbs, pilgrimage, or even bloodletting, because love, if left untreated, was a danger to health. And the idea caught fire. Romantic stories across Europe began portraying love as a kind of madness, a noble disease, a beautiful suffering. Heroes wasted away for love. Heroines went blind with grief. Lovers leapt from towers, drank poison, disguised themselves, crossed battlefields for one glimpse of a hand, a voice, a promise. To hurt for love was to prove its truth. One character in a 14th century French play declares, "If I eat, I betray her. If I sleep, I forget her. If I smile, I lie." This wasn't considered unhealthy. It was considered chivalric. But while knights and poets glamorized agony, others took a different path. Some turned love into science. Yes, science. Medieval philosophers and alchemists debated whether love originated in the heart, the liver, or the brain. Some believed it was caused by vapors rising from the blood. Others thought it was a spiritual ray sent through the eyes, entering one soul and altering the other. This theory was called the doctrine of sight. According to it, love wasn't born from touch or talk, but from gaze, a glance, a moment. When two eyes locked, a mystical beam passed between them, awakening desire. Sounds strange? Consider that the word eye-beam appears in Shakespeare, who lived centuries later, and who was deeply influenced by this tradition. Love, then, was something seen before it was felt. This also led to the belief in soulmates, not quite in the modern romantic sense, but in a mystical one. Some believed that certain souls were born from the same celestial pattern, that they were mirrored halves. If they met, their union would be electric, irresistible, and potentially catastrophic. Because fate in the medieval mind was not always kind. Two people meant for each other might still be separated by class, vows, war, or death. And yet, the belief endured. In Welsh folklore, lovers shared the same dream. In Norse sagas, soulmates were guided by ravens. In Persian tales, they bled in the same places. In Christian mysticism, they prayed the same words, without knowing. All of this made love seem larger than life, no longer just a feeling, but a destiny. And yet medieval people also understood love in smaller ways, in daily gestures, in devotion, in shared labor. A woman weaving a shirt for her husband before he rode to battle, a man planting rosemary by the window for the wife who missed her home. Two peasants rising before dawn to milk cows side by side, never saying, "I love you," but showing it in rhythm. There are letters between medieval spouses, not filled with poetry, but with deep care. One husband wrote from a distant town, "I saw a woman with hair like yours and thought I had gone mad. The rest of the day, I was no good at all." Another, from a wife, I have laid your cloak near the fire. The cat sleeps on it. It smells of you still. These fragments remind us that love wasn't only for the noble, the doomed, the poetic. It was for everyone, even those who didn't have the words for it, even those who were told not to feel it, even those who feared it, prayed against it, and yet welcomed it anyway. Because in the Middle Ages, love was never simple. It was tangled with religion, riddled with guilt, saturated with longing. But it was real. It burned behind convent walls. It slipped notes between castle stones. It stood beneath gallows. It waited in fields. It whispered through shutters. It risked ruin and defied death. And it never, ever stopped. Imagine standing in a stone corridor, cold beneath your bare feet. The candlelight flickers. The silence hums with centuries of vows. Behind you is the chapel. Before you, the cell. In your hands, Scripture. And somewhere, buried under layers of faith and fear, lies a body that still wants. To the outside world, medieval monks and nuns were holy figures, pure, disciplined, removed from desire. They had chosen a life of celibacy, a life without flesh. But behind cloistered walls, things were far more human. Because celibacy isn't a switch you flip. It's a war you fight, day after day, in thought, in dreams, in silence. Let's begin in the monastery. A monk rises at midnight for matins. The stone floor bites into his soles. He chants by candlelight, reciting psalms meant to chase away temptation. But temptation doesn't care for schedules. He returns to his cell, lies flat on a wooden board, and closes his eyes. And the dreams come. Not always sinful, sometimes just warm, sometimes soft, sometimes only a memory of touch, a scent, a smile. Enough to disturb sleep, enough to wake in sweat and shame. He confesses in the morning, flagellates himself, writes, Lord, why did you give me hands if not to hold? Why did you give me eyes that remember her skin? These words weren't rare. Medieval monks left behind thousands of confessions, journals, and letters, many of which tell the story of desire, not denial. Some monks struggled quietly, others fell. There are records of brothers sneaking out through garden gates, meeting lovers in barns or woods. Some disguised themselves, throwing cloaks over their robes. One monk in England was caught with a woman in a cemetery. When questioned, he claimed he was conducting a ritual. The court didn't buy it. In more extreme cases, whole communities were corrupted. One 14th century abbey in Germany was found to be housing multiple illicit unions between monks and village girls. The scandal reached the bishop. Punishments were swift: exile, penance, silence. But the stories lingered. And then there were the nuns. Their world was smaller, quieter, but just as complex. Many girls were placed in convents not by choice, but by family design. Daughters who wouldn't marry, wives sent away, women too clever or too inconvenient. The church said they were brides of Christ, but Christ did not kiss them, did not answer the ache on cold nights. And so some turned to each other. There are letters, beautiful, intimate, heartbreaking, between nuns who loved one another deeply, not always physically, but always fully. One wrote, When I see your hands in prayer, I tremble. You make the incense sweeter. Another, after being separated from her companion, penned, They say I am married to God. Then why do I dream of your breath on my neck? Some of these women were punished. Others were simply watched, relocated, moved from convent to convent like chess pieces. But not all longing came from within. Priests visited. Pilgrims passed through. Messages were exchanged with outsiders, sometimes hidden in embroidery, sometimes tucked inside loaves of bread. In Italy, a nun named Sister Benedetta claimed to be receiving visions, heavenly ecstasies. The Mother Superior praised her holiness until it was revealed that her visions involved long trances with another nun, alone in the chapel. The investigation found bruises, teeth marks. Benedetta was stripped of her title, but some say the other nun wept for years. In a world that worshipped restraint, those who took vows of celibacy were placed on a pedestal. But the higher you stand, the harder you fall, and some fell hard. Let's return to the convent. Not all transgressions were gentle letters and trembling hands. Some were tangled, chaotic, and scandalous, love triangles behind cloister walls. One infamous case comes from a Spanish abbey in the 15th century. A young novice, Sister Inez, was courted, secretly, by a visiting priest. But another nun, Sister Clara, was also in love with her. The story unfolded like a tragic ballad. Whispers, jealousy, confessions. Eventually, Clara poisoned the priest's wine, not fatally, but enough to send him away with illness and suspicion. Inez never knew. Clara confessed on her deathbed. The records are vague, but the tale was retold for generations. The nun who loved too much. Then there were the schemes so elaborate they seemed fictional. In one French convent, a man feigned blindness to gain entry as a servant, claimed to be a humble brother of faith needing shelter. The nuns pitied him, let him tend the gardens. One nun fell in love. He wasn't blind. He wasn't even religious. When discovered months later, he fled. No record survives of what happened to the nun, but church officials launched a full inquiry. The convent was cleansed and placed under stricter supervision. Desire makes poets. It also makes liars. And while many monks and nuns lived sincerely chaste lives, the struggles they wrote about were some of the most raw and honest in medieval literature. Paradoxically, the people who vowed to avoid the flesh often wrote the most about it. Take Peter Abelard, the famed philosopher-monk. His affair with Eloise, brilliant, forbidden, unforgettable, is legendary. After they were discovered, Abelard was attacked and castrated. Both were forced into religious life. But their letters, written from separate monasteries, are among the most passionate in history. Eloise wrote, "God knows I never sought anything in you but yourself. I looked for no marriage bond, no name, no status. I desired you, not what the world called yours." These were not the words of a sinless nun. These were the words of a woman who loved completely and was punished for it. Abelard, in return, wrote of guilt, of shame, but also of longing. Their letters reveal not just memory, but undying affection, even within cloister walls, even through forced silence. This wasn't unique. Nuns wrote mystical poems that blurred the line between divine rapture and physical ecstasy. They described Christ not as distant judge, but as a lover, bleeding, tender, embracing. Some even claimed visions of being kissed by angels, held by saints, pierced by divine light. Were these visions holy or sublimated desire? It's hard to say. But the language, aching, trembling, surrendered, sounded an awful lot like love. And then there were those who broke their vows completely. A monk who fathered children with a local baker's wife. A nun who escaped and married a traveling merchant. a bishop who maintained a household of nieces suspiciously close in age. Most were punished. A few were protected, depending on who they were. But in the end, even the most devout struggled, because celibacy in the Middle Ages wasn't just about abstaining from touch. It was about controlling the imagination, the dream, the fleeting spark that arrived during prayer and refused to leave. And that was nearly impossible. Even the most spiritual thinkers confessed it. Saint Jerome wrote of his battle, "I live in the desert, but my mind is filled with dancing girls." Saint Augustine, too, admitted, "Give me chastity, but not yet." These weren't just saints, they were men. Men who knew what it meant to want and to try not to. So what do we make of it? Perhaps this: that desire is not undone by vows. That longing doesn't die in silence. That the body remembers even when the mouth says no. And that the people most celebrated for purity were, beneath their robes, simply human. Which is why the stories of monks and nuns still move us. Not because they were perfect, but because they weren't. Because behind every locked chapel door was a candle flickering for something more. And sometimes, someone. Let's walk into 2 bedrooms. In one, silk sheets, carved bedposts, perfumed linens, and velvet drapes. In the other, straw bedding, smoke-stained beams, and the sound of chickens roosting nearby. Same world, same century. But these rooms might as well be different planets. Because in the Middle Ages, love, and how you expressed it, depended entirely on your place in the world. Let's begin at the top. If you were rich, truly rich, a noble or royalty, your love life was more performance than passion. Your marriage was likely arranged. Your partner was chosen for their bloodline, not their eyes. And your bed was not just for sleep, or even pleasure. It was for politics. The noble bedchamber was a stage. When heirs were born, it mattered how, where, and with whom watching. If you were a queen, there might be attendants in the room when you gave birth, or even when you first lay with your new husband. All to prove legitimacy. Privacy? Rare. Authentic romance? Rarer. But that doesn't mean desire didn't exist. Noble women kept lovers, though discreetly. Nobles of both sexes exchanged letters, coded, poetic, sometimes scandalous. There are entire collections of love poetry from French courts, where dukes and duchesses poured out longing in metaphor, falcons for lovers, hunting for seduction, roses for surrender. In one 14th century poem, a lady writes, "I give thee not my lips, but their shadow. I give thee not my name, but my sigh." These words were often never spoken aloud. They were embroidered into handkerchiefs, slipped into gloves, hidden inside books. For nobles, love was a chess match, clever, masked, and dangerously elegant. Affairs happened, but the rules were strict. A noble woman caught with a lover could be exiled, imprisoned, even executed. A nobleman might get away with a scandal, but only if it didn't threaten inheritance or alliances. And yet, behind the stone walls of castles, love sometimes bloomed anyway. There are legends of forbidden unions between knights and ladies, queens and poets, kings and servants. Some ended in tragedy, others faded into history, their only trace a name scratched into a windowsill or a locket buried with its wearer. Now, step outside the castle. Let's visit a peasant's home. Here, love is simpler, not easier, but simpler. You married someone from your village, or from the next one over. Your family knew theirs. You'd seen them grow up. Maybe you shared harvests, meals, chores. Romance wasn't roses. It was routine. There was little time for flirtation. Days were full of work, fields, firewood, livestock. But in the cracks between duties came glances, songs, the brush of hands at the well, a cup shared at the festival, and sometimes, under the stars or beside the barn, came something more. Marriage wasn't always about love, but sometimes love followed. And in the poorest homes, affection wasn't expressed through gifts. It was expressed through help. A man who carried water for his wife, a woman who mended her husband's only shirt, a pair who laughed over burnt bread, a mother who pressed a kiss to her husband's temple before he left for the fields. There were no silk sheets, no perfumes, no lockable doors, but there was warmth. Even intimacy was different. In castles, sex might be scheduled, expected on wedding night, then whispered about by servants. In cottages, it was squeezed between chores, shared under blankets while children slept feet away. It wasn't always about desire. It was about togetherness, survival, closeness in the cold. Some slept on the floor, some on straw, some on benches, but they slept together. And yet poverty had its costs. Romance was often crushed by hunger. A failed crop meant empty bellies and empty beds. Childbirth was dangerous. Sickness stole partners in the night. Grief settled over love like a frost. And even those who loved deeply rarely had time to say it. No sonnets, no letters, just hands held a little longer than needed. Just soup kept warm by the hearth. Just quiet. But don't mistake quiet for absence. Some of the most enduring love stories were never written down. They were lived, carried forward in lullabies, in recipes, in gestures passed from grandmother to granddaughter. Because while the rich might have loved with flair, the poor loved with constancy. And constancy, in a hard world, was everything. Let's linger a little longer in the chambers of the rich, because while peasant love was shaped by survival, noble love was shaped by ceremony. Among the upper classes, even intimacy had a script. In some courts, couples prepared for their wedding night with ritual baths, scented with herbs like lavender or thyme. Nobles might be dressed by attendants, led to a bedchamber decorated with garlands, candles, and embroidered sheets. The bed itself was often large, ornate, and deliberately elevated, sometimes with stairs. And when it came time to consummate the marriage, they weren't always alone. As strange as it sounds, witnesses were sometimes present, either inside the room or just beyond a curtain, to confirm the act had taken place. This wasn't about voyeurism, it was about legitimacy, proof that heirs born from the union were born of actual union. In one French wedding, the bride's slipper was stolen by giggling attendants after the couple was tucked into bed. A symbolic gesture, yes, but one that underscored the presence of others in what should have been a private moment. And even after marriage, intimacy wasn't always spontaneous. For queens and noblewomen, their bodies were often treated as state property, their cycles tracked, their bedrooms monitored. Letters survive from royal advisors discussing how best to encourage a king to visit his queen's bedchamber, for the sake of succession, of course. One document from England refers to a queen's monthly summons, as though her womb were a courtroom. Romance, perhaps, but also duty. Of course, not all noble unions were cold. Some defied expectations, like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II, whose early marriage burned with passion before collapsing into rivalry, or Edward I and Eleanor of Castile, whose bond was deep and enduring. When Eleanor died, Edward erected 12 memorial crosses across England, each marking a place where her body rested during its journey home. Sometimes even kings truly grieved, but while the rich were busy managing affection within gilded cages, the poor lived a different story, one of quiet resilience. Let's return to the village. In the heart of winter, a peasant couple curls together on a straw mattress. The wind whistles through the thatch. Their hands are cracked, their backs sore, but between them is warmth, not just from the fire, but from familiarity. They've seen each other through plagues and bad harvests. They've buried children, shared crusts of bread. They don't speak of love, they live it. One villager wrote in a will, "To my wife I leave the hearth, and all that was ever warm between us. No gold, no poetry, just the fire they tended together." Another man, after his wife's death, placed her wooden comb beneath his bed and never touched it again. His neighbors said he spoke to it every night. These weren't gestures for show. They were acts of devotion born from endurance. And sometimes their love found strange but beautiful expressions. One couple in Bohemia was buried holding hands. Archaeologists found their bodies side by side in a shallow grave, their fingers interlocked. Their bones showed signs of hard labor. No jewelry, no wealth. Just two people who, even in death, stayed close. Because for the poor, love wasn't written in letters. It was written in calluses, in songs hummed while mending clothes, in the rhythm of shared footsteps, in the act of staying, even when it would have been easier to walk away. And that, perhaps, is what sets their stories apart. The rich had silk and ceremony. The poor had presence. One noble might write 10 sonnets and stray. One peasant might say nothing and stay for 50 years. And in the end, which is the greater romance? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. But it reminds us that love, in all its forms, ornate or humble, has always found a way. Through stone walls, through straw roofs, through whispered poems and shared burdens, because no matter the class, no matter the coin, one truth remained. Everyone wanted to be held. In a world without texting, without phones, without private rooms or midnight calls, how did you tell someone you loved them? You wrote it down. You whispered it into things. You trusted magic. Welcome to the softest, strangest, and most enchanting corner of medieval love, the world of letters, charms, and spells. Let's begin with the love letter. We might think of love letters as modern, but long before Valentine's cards and scented stationery, medieval people were pouring out their hearts in ink, on parchment, wood, even cloth. These weren't always flowery. Some were raw, desperate, fragile. A 13th century English woman wrote to her lover, "I send you this with the thread of my sleeve. If you do not return, I will never sew again." Another, from a knight to his lady, "I dreamed last night that your hair tangled mine, and I woke weeping, for it was only the wind." These were not poetic exercises. They were acts of bravery. In a world where letters could be intercepted, misread, or used against you, every word risked exposure. But people still wrote. Some letters were coded, hidden in riddles or metaphors. Others were dictated to scribes, especially if the writer was illiterate. In one German town, a priest was secretly employed to write love notes for the entire village. His diary contains entries like, "Today I compared Greta's smile to spring onions. She approved." Not all messages were written, though. Some were carried in objects: a ribbon from a sleeve, a carved token, a pressed flower, a lock of hair. In Italy, lovers sometimes exchanged hazelnuts, inside of which were tucked tiny scraps of paper. One 14th century nut, preserved in a museum, reads simply, "You make my bread sweeter." Some gifts were more elaborate. In Hungary, a woman stitched a message into the hem of a man's shirt. "If you stray, remember the warmth of my thread." These were not just tokens, they were spells, because in the medieval world, love and magic often danced together. Folk traditions, passed down through midwives, herbalists, and old women by the fire, offered dozens of ways to attract affection, ignite passion, or bind hearts. Let's explore a few. Medieval love potions weren't brewed in cauldrons. They were usually simple mixtures: wine steeped with herbs, honey mixed with ash, milk stirred with rose petals. Some were innocent. Drink this and think of me. Others were more potent and dangerous. One recipe from the 14th century France reads, "Take rue, basil, mint, and a drop of your own blood. Steep in red wine beneath a waxing moon. Whisper the beloved's name 7 times. Serve warm." Yes, really. Did it work? Maybe. Maybe not. But belief has its own power. And when you've got nothing but longing, even a few herbs and a whispered name feel like hope. Some potions were used to forget, to dull the ache. Midwives gave them to widows, to abandoned girls, to boys who couldn't sleep for want of someone who didn't want them. Because magic, like love, cuts both ways. Charms were written on paper, etched into wood, or knotted into fabric. One English charm instructed a woman to braid her hair while repeating, "3 threads I twist, one for my heart, one for his, one for what lies between." She was to bury the braid beneath his doorstep. If he dreamed of her within 3 nights, he would fall in love. Other spells used sound. In Ireland, love songs were said to open the ribs of the heart. A bard's melody could bind a soul. In one tale, a man played his harp outside a closed window for 7 nights. On the 8th, the shutters opened. Coincidence? Maybe. But in love, timing is everything. Some lovers performed secret hand fastings, mock weddings, or symbolic ones. A red thread tied around both wrists. A coin passed from tongue to tongue. A candle burned in silence as both whispered their names to the flame. These rituals weren't legal. They weren't church approved. But they were real to the people who performed them. Because when your world is full of rules, rituals become rebellion. And in that rebellion, there's intimacy. Every act of medieval love carried risk. Not just risk of rejection, but a ruin. So people created ways to hold on to love, through symbols, rituals, and even curses. Yes, curses. Because just as there were potions to attract love, there were spells to punish betrayal. Let's begin with the binding gone wrong. In a village near Cologne, a woman was abandoned by her lover after 2 years of secret meetings. He married someone else. In response, she visited a local cunning woman, a folk healer, and returned home with a charm, a clay figure of her ex, wrapped in red twine, buried under his barn. Within the month, the man fell ill. His marriage soured. Villagers whispered that the milk soured too. Coincidence? Maybe. But in medieval minds, love was not just emotion, it was energy, and energy could be bent. Another common tradition involved mirror spells. A scorned lover would hold a polished metal mirror to the moon and whisper their beloved's name backward. The idea was that the reflection would disturb their dreams, pulling them back. Some went further. A 15th century English charm advised, place his name beneath a black candle. Let it burn while you cry. If he does not return, he shall never rest. Dark, dangerous, but born from the same place as every love poem, longing. Yet not all medieval love magic was so heavy. Many simply wanted to preserve joy. One bohemian bride carried a sachet of crushed violet, rosemary, and clover beneath her bodice to keep her husband's heart gentle. Another woman tied 3 knots in her apron string before each harvest festival. One for luck, one for laughter, one so he sees only me. Even when love was already present, it needed tending. Medieval people believed that love could fade if not nourished, that passion, like crops, could wither. So they wrote each other small notes, offered shared meals, sang at twilight, not because they were grand gestures, but because they were constant ones. In some regions, couples celebrated their own private anniversaries, not of weddings, but of meetings. A look exchanged in spring, a dance at Michaelmas, a glove returned in winter. These days were remembered in silence, in secret smiles, in tokens only the two of them understood. It wasn't about poetry. It was about presence. And through all of this, love letters, potions, charms, anniversaries, there ran a quiet, defiant belief that love mattered, even in a world that punished it, even in a church that feared it, even in bodies that aged, in fields that failed, in hearts that sometimes wandered. Because while the church tried to moralize love, and nobles tried to control it, and peasants tried to survive it, love kept blooming, in hedgerows, in candlelight, in the pressed petals of a flower tucked between pages. It bloomed in convent gardens despite the silence. It bloomed between hands dirtied by toil. It bloomed in songs hummed beneath one's breath while stirring soup for 2. And it bloomed most tenderly in the belief that even the smallest gesture, a thread, a word, a sip of wine, could carry the weight of a heart. So what was sex really like in medieval times? Messy, risky, regulated, sometimes poetic, often not. It was full of longing and fear, of duty and secrecy, of letters and lies and brief moments of light in long corridors of silence. It happened in castles, in barns, in convents, in the back of carts. It happened with permission, without it, with love, without it. It was a human act made strange by 1,000 rules, and made sacred by the refusal to stop wanting, even when told not to. Because in the end, medieval love wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. And perhaps that's the truest love of all.